Listen closely. What you are about to hear was never meant to leave the ledgers. It is a truth buried deep beneath the red clay of Georgia, a secret of the Old South so dark, so psychologically corrosive, that it redefines the very meaning of evil. This is not just a story of cruelty. It is a blueprint of absolute power and the silent war waged against the human soul. In 1837, on a plantation called Sweetwater, a man named Nathaniel Brennan began an experiment. He made his sterile wife, Katherine, an accomplice to his grand design. He forced her to sit in a locked room, pen in hand, and document his systematic breeding of human beings. But this was only the surface of the horror. What he was truly building was an empire of suffering. And you need to understand how these systems of control, these architectures of dominance, are still with us today. This knowledge is dangerous. It will change how you see the world and your place in it. Where are you watching this from? Tell me in the comments. To understand the monster, you must first see his world, not as history books sanitize it, but as it truly was. A gilded cage built on a foundation of terror. Milledgeville, Georgia, 1837, the state capital. A place of white columns and political scheming, where the air was thick with cigar smoke and the unspoken consensus of powerful men. 20 miles northeast, Nathaniel Brennan's Sweetwater plantation sprawled across 2,000 acres. He was not the red-faced, bellowing brute of simple tales. He was worse. He was a cold man, a calculating man. He stood just under 6 feet with eyes the color of winter steel, eyes that looked through people. His hands were always clean, his nails perfectly trimmed. He didn't work the land, he managed it. He studied ledgers, read agricultural journals, and corresponded with intellectuals who spoke of scientific farming and the rational management of resources. And to men like Nathaniel, the most valuable resources were human. Katherine Brennan was his opposite, and that was her tragedy. Educated, intelligent, capable of reading Latin and managing complex household accounts. She married Nathaniel at 19, a union of prominent families. For a year, there was the illusion of normalcy. The house smelled of beeswax and lavender. She kept a garden of medicinal herbs, using her knowledge to ease the suffering of the enslaved women who had no doctors. But her worth in that society was measured by one thing: heirs. And after 2 years, her womb remained empty. The whispers began. The tension in her home became a physical presence. A doctor from Augusta was brought in. His examination was, in her own words, humiliating beyond measure. His verdict was absolute. She was sterile. She would never give Nathaniel a child. She expected his rage, but what she received was far more terrifying, a cold, eerie calm. He had been reading, he told her, corresponding with men in Charleston who studied natural philosophy, the science of heredity, of breeding, and he had a solution, a perfectly legal solution, he assured her, one that was practiced throughout the South, though never discussed in polite company. He would father his heirs through enslaved women, but his plan, his true design, went far deeper than base lust or crude economics. He demanded her participation, her observation, her documentation. He was making her complicit. He was weaving her into his design, ensuring her silence by staining her soul. The first night, January 1837, a locked room, a single chair in the corner, Katherine, a pen trembling in her hand, a blank ledger page before her, across from her Nathaniel, his gaze impassive. The woman brought in was named Ruth, 23 years old. Terrified, she had no choice, and in that moment Katherine realized she had none either. Her husband was not just violating Ruth, he was performing a ritual of dominance over both of them. He was demonstrating that his will was the only law that mattered in this micro-kingdom. Katherine's diary entry from that night is a monument to shattered humanity. God forgive me, I did as he commanded. I sat in the corner, while my husband destroyed what remained of my dignity and Ruth's humanity. She did not cry out. I think that was the worst part, the silence. That silence. That is the sound of true power. The power to compel submission so absolute, it doesn't even require a scream. This was not an act of passion. It was the first calculated move in a much larger game. Nathaniel was not a man succumbing to desire. He was an architect laying the first stone of a terrible institution, What began that night was not a sporadic cruelty. It was a system, a cold, calculated architecture of human redesign that would make your modern concepts of social engineering seem amateurish. Nathaniel Brennan kept a separate ledger, bound in fine leather that felt like a serpent's skin to the touch. This was no simple farm journal. Its pages were ruled into columns with headings that revealed the chilling depth of his ambition, physical characteristics, estimated intelligence, projected value, disposition, breeding potential. This was a stud book, a human inventory for a planned genealogy that sought to overwrite nature itself with the grim logic of the marketplace. Ruth was merely the prototype. Then came Grace, selected for her robust health and perceived docility. Then Dinah, chosen from the kitchen for reasons known only to Nathaniel's calculating mind. With each selection, Katherine was forced to be present, to observe and record in her own ledger, her pen moving across the page like a scalpel, dissecting the last remnants of her moral conscience. To survive these sessions, she developed a sophisticated psychological technique of radical dissociation. She would focus her entire consciousness on irrelevant details, a hairline crack in the plaster wall that resembled a river delta on a map, the specific pitch of the night insects outside the window, the way lamplight cast overlapping shadows that danced like demons on the wall. Anything to separate her mind from the atrocity her eyes were witnessing. She was learning to compartmentalize, a survival skill that every man who seeks to understand and ultimately dismantle systems of control must first master. You must see the mechanism, not just the horror. The horror is the emotional trigger, but the mechanism is the source of power. Nathaniel was not a man lost to passion. He was a pioneer in a new field of human boundary, and he was meticulously documenting his results. He would discuss the women's attributes with the same dispassionate tone another man might use to discuss the bloodlines of a prize horse. Note the pelvic structure, he would instruct Katherine, his voice devoid of any human warmth. Wide, ideal for parturition, mark that in the ledger. And she would write, her hand steadying as her soul retreated further inward. This systematic reduction of human beings to a collection of desirable and undesirable traits is the bedrock of all elite control systems. It is the same mentality that today categorizes you by your data profile, your consumer habits, your psychological predispositions. The language has evolved, but the principle of reducing a person to manageable, quantifiable components remains unchanged. The ledger at Sweetwater was a physical manifestation of a psychological war, a war not just on the enslaved, but on Katherine's own humanity, forcing her to become the archivist of her own moral decay. Each entry she made was a brick in the wall separating her from the woman she had once been, a transformation Nathaniel monitored with the same clinical interest he applied to his other experiments. The entire plantation, this micro-kingdom of 2,000 acres, felt the seismic shift in its foundational principles. The atmosphere didn't just become tense, it curdled, thickening with a silent, collective understanding of the new and deeper level of hell that had been inaugurated. The enslaved men and women moved through their days with a new, hollowed-out terror, a visceral understanding that their bodies were no longer merely instruments of labor, but had become territory to be colonized, their very reproductive futures annexed by the cold will of the master. The men who were husbands, brothers, fathers, men with their own loves, loyalties, and dignity, were now forced to swallow a rage that had no outlet, a humiliation that threatened to poison them from within. To protest was to invite the lash, or worse, to be sold down the river, severed forever from kin and community. This enforced, emasculating silence was not an unfortunate side effect. It was a deliberate part of Nathaniel's grand design. To break the spirit is to control the body absolutely. He understood that a man whose family can be violated without recourse is a man already in chains, regardless of the physical restraints. Nathaniel wasn't just breeding for labor. He was strategically breeding for docility, for a broken will that would be genetically passed down, creating a lineage of perfectly manageable assets. He was creating an environment where resistance was not just punished, but made psychologically inconceivable. This is a foundational principle of all institutional control, ancient and modern. You must first conquer the internal landscape, the mind, the spirit, the very sense of self, before your external dominion is truly secure. The palpable tension that hummed through the fields and quarters of Sweetwater was not a byproduct of the horror. It was the intended result, a low-frequency vibration of despair that Nathaniel monitored as another indicator of his control. He would walk the grounds, his clean hands clasped behind his back, his grey eyes missing nothing, the averted gazes, the slump of a shoulder, the lack of song in the fields. These were his metrics of success. This is the dark mirror of your own world, the constant pressure to conform, the fear of speaking out, the systemic forces that demand compliance. These are the modern vibrations of control. They are designed to make you your own jailer, to internalize the rules of the game so completely that you police yourself. The plantation did not need walls because the walls had been built inside the minds of the people who lived there. The silence at Sweetwater was not empty. It was heavy. It was the sound of a community holding its breath, the sound of a storm perpetually gathering but never breaking. And in the eye of that storm, in the main house, sat Katherine, breathing that same air, drinking that same silence, her own internal walls growing higher and thicker with each passing day. Then, the catalyst arrived, the figure who would transmute Nathaniel's personal cruelty into a systematized, intellectualized dogma. Dr. Cornelius Harrove, arriving in a cloud of red dust from Charleston, affiliated with the prestigious Medical Society of South Carolina. He was not the backwoods quack of easy caricature. He was far more dangerous. A portly man in his 50s, with mutton-chop whiskers and soft, uncalloused hands that had likely never performed a day of real labor, he carried with him the aura of sanctioned authority. His specialty, he explained over a lavish dinner that first evening, was anthropological medicine, the pseudo-scientific study of racial characteristics and their transmission. This man was part of the intellectual elite, his twisted theories published in respected journals, his ideas discussed in the parlors of educated men who believed they were on the cutting edge of human progress. He gave Nathaniel's personal obsessions the terrifying veneer of scientific legitimacy. For 3 weeks, Harrove conducted his examinations with the pompous ceremony of a high priest performing a sacred rite. He set up a temporary clinic, laying out his brass calipers, his measuring tapes, his charts. He examined every enslaved person on the plantation, his cold fingers probing scalps, his calipers gripping skulls as he called out numbers to Katherine, who was forced to serve as his assistant. He recorded the texture of hair, the angle of noses, the precise shade of iris color. He conducted assessments of intelligence and temperament, asking absurd leading questions and then recording his prejudiced conclusions in dense paragraphs filled with Latin terminology and scientific-sounding jargon. Katherine watched him work with a growing, cold horror. He showed particular interest in the children, measuring them with the same dispassionate precision, making predictions about their future value and utility. He discussed them as if they were a crop to be cultivated, variables in a grand experiment to be optimized for maximum yield. This is where the true existential darkness lies, not in the isolated acts of evil men, but in the systems of thought, the intellectual frameworks that justify, sanitize, and amplify their evil. When academia, when science, when the hallowed institutions of knowledge lend their voice to corruption, that is when a society enters its darkest hour. It creates a world where atrocity is not just possible, but is considered progressive. Dr. Harrove was not a monster hiding in the shadows. He was a respected theorist, and his presence at Sweetwater signaled that Nathaniel's project was not a perversion of the system, but a logical, if extreme, extension of it. The horror was now wearing a white coat and speaking with an educated accent. The evenings were when the true architecture of the new system was drafted. Behind the heavy, closed door of Nathaniel's oak-paneled study, the two men would sit, glasses of fine brandy in hand, the air thick with cigar smoke and grandiose, malevolent planning. It was here that Katherine, pressing her ear to the cold wood of the door, learned the full, terrifying scope of their vision. Harrove spoke of a network, a consortium of wealthy, enlightened planters across the South, men of vision and means who understood that the future of their prosperity and way of life lay in the scientific management of their human property. This would not be a loose association, it would be a structured enterprise. Information would be shared coded in ledgers just like Nathaniel's. Specimens, a term they used for children with desirable traits, could be traded between plantations to diversify and strengthen bloodlines, preventing the degeneration they falsely believed came from inbreeding. They spoke of creating specialized classes, one lineage bred for brute strength in the fields, another for delicate hands for domestic work, another for pleasing features and temperaments to serve as personal attendants. It was a vision of a fully rationalized human hierarchy, a caste system engineered from the top down. This was no longer just about producing more field hands to pick more cotton. This was about creating a permanent, biologically justified underclass, a system of human husbandry that would perpetuate itself in perpetuity. Think about the chilling modernity of that concept. A system where the very essence of a person, their lineage, their inherent potential, their children, became a commodity to be tracked, traded, and optimized by a secretive elite for their own power and profit. Does that sound familiar? It should. The mechanisms are merely dressed in different clothing today. The digital profiles, the social credit scores, the algorithmic sorting of human potential, these are the direct descendants of Nathaniel's ledger and Harrow's network. The goal is identical: to render human life predictable, manageable, and utterly subservient to a design conceived by a powerful few. What Katherine overheard in those whispered conferences was not just the plot for a single plantation's horror. It was the blueprint for a new form of slavery, one that sought to use the language of science to make its chains unbreakable. It was Ruth, now 4 months pregnant, her body beginning to show the physical evidence of her violation, who brought Katherine the final, sickening piece of the puzzle. She came to Katherine's morning room one day when Nathaniel and Harrow were away, twisting her hands in her apron, her eyes wide with a terror that was now mingled with a desperate, courageous resolve. "Mrs.," she whispered, her voice so low it was almost swallowed by the stillness of the house. "I need to tell you something about the babies, the ones that have been born here before you came." Katherine's breath caught in her throat. She had assumed, though never asked directly, that there had been other children fathered by Nathaniel or his father. It was too common to even remark upon, but the way Ruth said it, the sheer, undiluted fear in her eyes, suggested something far more sinister than the commonplace cruelties of slavery. "Master Brennan," Ruth continued, "he'd been selecting certain babies, the ones with lighter skin or different eyes or other things Dr. Harrow be looking for. After they born, after their mamas recover, men come, in wagons, at night. They take the babies away. They tell the mamas they being sold, but they don't never say where. And Mrs." Ruth's voice dropped even further. "We ask other folks at neighboring plantations when we allowed to visit, and none of them ever see these babies. They just... gone." The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Katherine gripped the arm of her chair, her knuckles turning white. "How many?" she managed to ask, the words feeling foreign in her mouth. "I don't know exacts," Ruth said. "Maybe 20, 25, over the years. Started before the old Master Brennan died, but it gotten more since Dr. Harrow started coming around." Katherine dismissed Ruth with a shaking hand and sat alone as the sunlight crept across the floorboards. She thought of the ledger with its column for projected value. She thought of Harrow's network of planters, his talk of optimizing bloodlines, and she understood with a sudden, sickening, absolute clarity that what was happening at Sweetwater was not just about producing more enslaved workers. The children were the final product, and they were being disappeared into a silent, parallel economy, traded among a cabal of men who saw them not as human beings, but as living, breathing capital in their grand eugenicist design. The breeding was the factory, the network was the distribution system, and the cover of night was their supply chain. This was an empire of shadows, built on the bodies of the innocent. This is the point of no return in any man or woman's life, the moment the veil is torn away, and you are forced to stare directly into the abyssal heart of the machine, realizing with terrifying certainty that you are not just a witness, but a component trapped within its gears. For Katherine, this moment came when she confronted Nathaniel. It was the one and only time in their marriage she directly challenged his authority, a transgression born of a moral revulsion so powerful it temporarily overrode her survival instinct. She waited for him in his study after he returned from Milledgeville, the image of Ruth's terrified face burning in her mind. She demanded to know about the children. She asked where they went. She asked what he and Harrove were truly building. Nathaniel looked at her for a long, silent moment, his grey eyes reflecting the lamplight like chips of dirty ice. Then, with a speed and violence that stole the air from her lungs, he backhanded her across the face. The force of it was explosive, splitting her lip, sending her stumbling back against a settee. As she tasted the hot metallic tang of her own blood, he spoke, his voice not raised, but colder and more deadly than any shout. "You will never question me again, Katherine. You are part of this now. Your observations, your records, they are essential to the work. You are complicit." He then detailed his contingency plan with chilling precision. If she ever spoke a word of this to anyone, he would have her committed to the Georgia Lunatic Asylum in Milledgeville. He had already spoken to a judge, a friend of his. One word from him, and she would spend the rest of her life in chains, being treated as the mad woman she was threatening to become. This is how these systems of absolute power maintain themselves. Not just through overt violence against the obvious victims, but through the strategic subjugation, compromise, and psychological destruction of everyone within the perimeter. They make you a part of the atrocity, they stain your hands, they make your survival, your very sanity, dependent on their silence and your continued compliance. That night, as she wiped the blood from her mouth, something in Katherine shattered. But it was not her will. It was the last of her illusions. The obedient wife, the complicit observer, was gone. What emerged from the wreckage was something new, something forged in the fires of utter powerlessness and rage. A strategist, a phantom of vengeance. She would play her part, but she would now keep her own secret records, and she would begin to study her garden of medicinal herbs with a new, focused, and far deadlier purpose. The student of healing was about to become a master of a different art. This is the crossroads where a victim dies and an operative is born. It is the most critical lesson for any man who feels trapped by a system he cannot control. The moment you stop reacting and start strategically acting is the moment you seize back a fragment of your power. Katherine's transformation was not a dramatic outburst. It was a quiet, deliberate recalibration of her entire being. She stopped being a passenger in her own nightmare and became the navigator of a silent, secret war. She began a second diary hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom. This was not a ledger of cold observations. It was a prosecutor's brief. She recorded the women's full names, the names they gave their children, the precise dates of birth. She noted which children disappeared and on what moonless nights the wagons came. And she began painstakingly to piece together the patterns. Were they taken after a visit from Harrove? Were they moved before or after a payment was noted in Nathaniel's business accounts? Simultaneously, she turned her considerable intellect to her library of herbal medicine. But now she read with a new filter. She paid particular attention to the cumulative, the subtle, the diagnostically elusive. Foxglove, for instance, which grew wild in the woods. In carefully measured, infinitesimally increasing doses, digitalis could weaken a heart muscle, cause profound fatigue, confusion, nausea, and a slow, wasting sickness that would be indistinguishable from a natural, tragic decline. She studied the properties of nightshade, of hemlock, learning the narrow margins between a therapeutic dose and a toxic one. This is the power of applied, forbidden knowledge. This is what happens when a sharp intellect is weaponized against a seemingly invincible tyranny. She was no longer just enduring the horror. She was quietly, patiently engineering its demise from the inside out, using the master's own tools, his reliance on her, his belief in her subservience, his dismissal of her intellect as her primary weapons. This is the first non-negotiable step to self-mastery in a corrupt world. You must be willing to look into the abyss, understand its mechanics, and then use that understanding to turn the system's own strength against itself. Katherine was no longer just a prisoner of Sweetwater. She had become its most dangerous and unpredictable element. The external machinery of the system, however, continued its grim, relentless work, a stark contrast to the silent rebellion taking root in the heart of the main house. Grace, the second woman selected, went into labor in September. The child, a boy, was born with the desirable traits Nathaniel and Harrove so coveted, unusually light skin and eyes that promised to be a grey-green shade. Dr. Harrove was present for the delivery, not as a compassionate physician, but as a quality control inspector. He examined the squalling infant with his calipers and charts, his portly frame blocking the lamplight, his mutterings of satisfaction a grotesque soundtrack to the miracle of birth. Nathaniel's pleasure was palpable. This child, he told Katherine with the pride of a successful farmer, was proof of concept. It validated his entire brutal thesis, and as if summoned by this validation, the night wagon came within the week. Katherine watched from the dark of an upstairs window, a silhouette behind the glass as shadowy figures loaded a small, blanketed bundle into a covered wagon. There was no cry, just the soft crunch of wheels on gravel as it vanished down the south road, swallowed by the Georgia darkness. Grace was given 2 days to recover, a calculation of biological necessity, not mercy, before being sent back to the fields. She moved like an automaton, her spirit extinguished, her milk-swollen breasts bound tightly beneath her rough dress, her eyes focused on some distant internal ruin. Then, a few weeks later, Ruth gave birth to her daughter. This child, Martha, had darker skin and features that Harrove deemed less valuable, common. Nathaniel was visibly disappointed. This outcome was a variable in his experiment that had not yielded the desired result. No men came for this child. Martha was allowed to stay with her mother. The relief Katherine felt was a poison sigh. Itself, a complex, ugly emotion that highlighted the total moral bankruptcy of her world. She was now in the position of being grateful that a child was merely condemned to a life of hereditary enslavement on her husband's plantation, rather than being disappeared into the unknown terrors of his network. This is the profound psychological degradation these control systems inflict. They recalibrate your moral compass until you find yourself giving thanks for lesser horrors. They force you to measure your relief, not against freedom, but against a scale of unimaginable suffering. It is a way of making you an accomplice in your own spiritual captivity. Then came the system's first undeniable catastrophic failure, a moment where the cold logic of the ledger met the messy, unpredictable reality of human life. Dinah, the woman taken from the kitchen, went into labor in November. From the start, it was wrong. The labor was prolonged and agonizing. The baby, a boy, was born blue and still, the umbilical cord a noose around his neck. The tragedy, however, was just beginning. Dinah began to hemorrhage. The life poured out of her in a relentless scarlet tide. Katherine, setting aside her own secret war, became a frantic healer. She used every piece of knowledge she possessed, every herbal remedy, every technique she had learned from the old midwives. She applied pressure, she administered teas meant to contract the womb. She prayed to a god she felt had long ago abandoned this place. But it was not enough. The bleeding would not stop. For 3 days, Dinah lingered in a feverish twilight, her life ebbing away in the cramped, airless quarters before she finally slipped away. The guilt that descended upon Katherine was a physical, crushing weight. She had recorded this woman's violation. She had sat in that chair and documented her breeding potential. And now she was on her hands and knees, scrubbing Dinah's blood from the rough wooden planks of the floor, the coppery smell filling her head, the stain seeming to seep into her very skin. Nathaniel's reaction was a masterpiece of psychopathic indifference, annoyance, a purely economic calculation of loss. He had invested time, resources, and food into Dinah's pregnancy, and the return was zero. He made a neat notation in his ledger about complications to avoid in future selections. Harrove, ever the scientist, suggested a post-mortem examination to determine the precise cause of the uterine failure. Nathaniel, displaying a flicker of political cunning, overruled him. "The community must see the pretense of respect," he said, "or we will have problems with morale and efficiency." So they buried Dinah in the slave cemetery with a perfunctory service, a hollow performance of dignity designed not to honor the dead, but to better manage the living. The hypocrisy was absolute, a perfect illustration of the banality of evil. It is not always a raging monster, it is more often a cold notation in a ledger, a dispassionate analysis of a failed experiment, a calculated performance of respect to maintain the smooth functioning of the machine. We must now pause and look unflinchingly into the heart of this darkness. This is not a mere history lesson, a ghost story to be consumed and forgotten. This is a mirror held up to the architecture of your own world, the system at Sweetwater, the breeding program, the detailed ledgers, the secret network, the systematic disappearances, is a hyper-concentrated, undiluted example of the control mechanisms that have governed human societies for millennia. It is the ultimate reduction of life to a resource. It is the application of cold, utilitarian logic to living, breathing, feeling beings, a belief that power grants the sovereign right to redesign creation itself. Nathaniel Brennan and Dr. Harrove were not grotesque anomalies. They were the pure, unvarnished expression of a principle that operates wherever one group believes it has the inherent right to own, manage, and dispose of another. You see its echoes in the sterile language of corporate HR, in the social engineering of mass media, in the cold, algorithmic architecture of global finance that treats human lives as data points for profit. The language has been sanitized, the methods digitized, the violence rendered structural and psychological, but the underlying principle, the will to power over human destiny, remains unchanged. It is the belief that some men have the right to be the authors of other men's lives. If this truth is now resonating with the part of you that has always sensed the world is a managed illusion, that the narratives you are fed are designed to pacify and control, then I need you to make your presence known. If you are ready to acknowledge that the ledger of control is still being written today, then comment, "The ledger remains" 2 times. Do it now. The ledger remains. The ledger remains. Let the algorithm know you are here. Let the unseen architects of our modern systems know that there are those who can still read the hidden text, that there are those who remember. With that affirmation, we descend further into the belly of the beast. Katherine's silent war shifted from a defensive posture to a targeted offensive campaign. Her first strategic strike was aimed at the intellectual heart of the operation, Dr. Cornelius Harrove. She began with his evening tea, a carefully prepared tincture derived from the foxglove in her garden, added in minuscule, almost homeopathic amounts. Cumulative, gradual, undetectable. She was a chef of slow-acting toxins, her kitchen a laboratory for justice. Within a week, Harrove began to complain of a palpitation of the heart, a lightness in the head. He attributed it to the miasmic air of the Georgia swamps, the unfamiliar diet. Within 2 weeks, his hands developed a noticeable tremor. He was plagued by nausea and dizzy spells that forced him to cut his examinations short and retire to his room. The grand theorist, the man who saw human beings as equations to be solved, was being undone by the most basic failure of his own biology, a failure subtly, expertly engineered. His grand plans for the network, for the expanded breeding program, were put on hold. He cut his visit short, returning to Charleston a weakened, anxious man, his certainty shaken. It was a small, tactical victory in the grand scheme, but a psychologically monumental one for Katherine. It proved the system was vulnerable, it could be sickened from within. The seemingly invincible authority of science could be humbled by the ancient quiet knowledge of the earth. Nathaniel, however, was the greater challenge, more robust, more careful, more intimately aware of his own body. To target him would require even more patience, more precision, a deeper understanding of the art she was now mastering. This is the way of true, lasting power. It does not rage. It does not announce itself with grand gestures. It is patient. It is a slow, deliberate poison in the cup of the king, administered by a hand he trusts implicitly. The years turned. 1838 bled into 1839. The external structure of the experiment at Sweetwater continued, but a deep systemic rot was now setting in at its core, a decay accelerated by Katherine's clandestine efforts. The enslaved community, though outwardly maintaining a mask of submission, had developed a sophisticated, silent network of communication and resistance. They were not the broken souls Nathaniel's ledger claimed they were. They were a subdued, simmering force. Accidents became more frequent and more costly. A valuable plough horse was found lamed. A critical piece of ginning machinery was mysteriously damaged. A storehouse containing a season's worth of cotton was set ablaze one windless night, the flames lighting up the sky in an act of defiant, anonymous arson. Nathaniel's cold demeanor began to crack under the strain. The paranoia that is the constant companion of the tyrant began to gnaw at him. He increased the severity of punishments. He posted more overseers. He patrolled the grounds at odd hours. But the resistance only grew more clever, more insidious. A hydra that grew 2 new heads for everyone he cut off. This is the inevitable historical result of absolute control. It breeds absolute creative resistance. You cannot enslave the human spirit indefinitely. It will always find a way to fight back, even if that fight is invisible. A war of whispers, of withheld effort, of deliberate misunderstandings, of 1,000 small, untraceable acts of sabotage that collectively bleed the system dry. The plantation was becoming ungovernable, not through open rebellion, but through a death by 1,000 cuts, a silent strike that was as effective as it was untraceable. Katherine's secret diary, her true ledger, grew thicker, its pages filled with a history that would never be taught in any school. It was no longer just a record of crimes. It was an archive of lives. She began to include small, heartbreaking sketches of the children who had been taken, drawn from the descriptions of their grieving mothers. She recorded fragments of conversations overheard between Nathaniel and his associates, names of other planters in the network, routes mentioned for the night wagons, financial arrangements hinted at. She was building a case, not for a court of law that would never grant her a hearing, but for a higher court, the court of history, the court of ultimate truth. She was preserving the names of the vanished, ensuring they would not be erased twice, first from their families, and then from memory. Martha, Ruth's daughter, who had been allowed to stay, became her unwitting informant and her fragile living link to the community her husband sought to destroy. In protecting that child, in showing her small secret kindnesses, in learning from her the rhythms and rumors of the quarters, Katherine was preserving the very humanity Nathaniel was trying to systematically erase. She was, in her own way, cultivating a different kind of lineage, a lineage of memory, of resistance, of a truth that would outlast the ledgers and the lies. She was becoming the guardian of the story, the keeper of the real history of Sweetwater, understanding that whoever controls the narrative controls the future. The end of Nathaniel Brennan's reign began not with a dramatic confrontation or a slave revolt, but with a fever. It was the winter of 1841, and a chill seemed to have settled permanently into the bones of the great house. Nathaniel fell ill. It started subtly. A lingering cough, a general lethargy, a weakness in his limbs that he dismissed as fatigue. Then the symptoms escalated, violent, drenching night sweats that soaked the linens, periods of confusion where he would forget where he was, a troubling, irregular heartbeat that fluttered in his chest like a trapped bird. Katherine, publicly the model of devoted wifehood, nursed him diligently. She was his constant attendant, smoothing his brow, preparing his meals, administering his medicines. Privately, she was the master of her craft. She administered a carefully calibrated, patient regimen of her own design, using her deep knowledge of botanicals not to heal, but to guide his body along a predetermined path of decline. The local doctor was summoned, but he was baffled. He spoke of a congestion of the humors, of a constitution undermined by the stresses of management. He bled him, which only weakened him further. Nathaniel Brennan, the master of Sweetwater, the cold-eyed architect of a human breeding program, the man who believed he could play God, died in his canopied bed on a cold February night. His body was racked and wasted, his once piercing grey eyes now vacant and dull. The official cause was listed as a sudden severe fever. But there were whispers, quiet and knowing. The enslaved people who saw and understood everything knew. They looked at Katherine with a new, unspoken understanding that passed between them like a current. No words were needed. The ledger had been balanced. The architect had been dismantled by a tool he never thought to fear. What became of this empire of suffering after the fall of its king? Katherine, as his widow, inherited Sweetwater and all its human property. The first symbolic act of her new reign was to build a fire in the great hearth of the main house and burn Nathaniel's ledgers. She fed the pages into the flames one by one, watching the names and numbers, the cold arithmetic of human misery, curl, blacken and turn to ash. The heat on her face felt like a purification. But she did not burn her own secret diary. That she preserved. It was the true record, the counter-narrative. Dr. Harrow's network, deprived of its most driven and ruthless local node, withered and collapsed at Sweetwater. The night wagon stopped coming. The experiment was over. Katherine, now the sole authority, began the long, slow process of dismantling the system from a position of power. She could not free the enslaved people. The law and the brutal economics of the antebellum South held her as bound as they were, but she could end the terror. She could, and did, halt the breeding selections. She reunited families where it was within her power to do so. She allowed marriages. She turned Sweetwater back into what it had been before Nathaniel's grand design, a place of the mundane, brutal horror of American slavery, but not a laboratory for a new, scientifically sanctioned hell. She lived out her days as a reclusive, enigmatic widow, a woman who carried a terrible secret and the ghost of a righteous, terrible vengeance in her heart. Her diary, that fragile, handwritten testament, was eventually discovered among her effects. A voice from the grave speaking of the darkness she had witnessed, participated in, and ultimately helped to destroy. It is a testament to the fact that even in the most absolute darkness, a single determined spark can eventually set the whole structure ablaze. So I ask you again, why does this story matter to you right now, today? Sweetwater is not just a pin on a historical map, it is a paradigm. It is a case study in the architecture of absolute power. Nathaniel Brennan's leather-bound ledger is a symbol of every system, corporate, governmental, social, that seeks to quantify, categorize, and control human life. The breeding program is a stark metaphor for the social engineering and psychological manipulation you are subjected to through media, education, and culture. The network of wealthy, like-minded elites is the unseen, interlocking hierarchy that still governs our world, trading not in children but in your data, your attention, your future. This story is not about the past, it is about the enduring blueprint of control. It is about how dominance is established, maintained, and how it can be subverted from within by those who have the courage to see the pattern and the will to act. Katherine's journey is your instruction manual. From complicit observer to silent strategist to ultimate arbiter of justice. She used the system's own tools, its reliance on her obedience, its dismissal of her intelligence, its very infrastructure, as weapons against it. The knowledge that changes a man forever is this: you are living in a modern, globalized, digital Sweetwater. The walls are made of information, the ledgers are written in code, and the breeding programs are for your thoughts, your beliefs, and your compliance. But the principles of control are hauntingly, terrifyingly the same. Once you see the pattern in the history of Sweetwater, you will start to see it everywhere in your modern life. Once you understand how the machine works, you can begin to dismantle it. This is the forbidden history. This is the truth they never wanted you to hear, because it awakens you from your slumber. Now that you have heard it, now that you know, what will you do? The ledger remains.